Hello and welcome to Educated STEM. I'm Kate, the founder of Educated STEM, and today we are in possibly our second to last video with my friend and collaborator, Dr. Mahadeo Sukhai. So we have a first series where we talk about his lived experiences as a low vision scientist and how that has affected his career. So please go back and watch those. Currently, we're in a deep dive into my questions on DEI, or idea as he prefers to say it. So today's question is, we view science as a meritocracy. So how does DEI affect productivity?
What's productivity?
Oh, now you have to just start that straight away, don't you, my love?
What's productivity is, it's a rhetorical question. I think how DEI affects productivity is perhaps, it's an interesting framing, right? Because in theory, inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility shouldn't affect productivity. But I think the question becomes, how do we define productivity, right? So, and if you're a graduate student, you are productive when? You are productive when you defend your master's. You're productive when you defend your PhD. And if you say that your ultimate measure of productivity as a graduate student is to achieve that final milestone, then everything prior to that is in service to that. You can't really measure how productive you're going to be until you're done, right? If you say, as a graduate student, my expectation of you is that you produce at least one new piece of knowledge, so you have at least one paper to your name, right? So the student who manages to have everything work for them, right? Who gets 3 papers, are they somehow more productive than the student who actually had to deal with nothing working through circumstances outside of their control and only getting 1? Right? Or you imagine, for example, that the student who is doing nothing but viability curves, right? Curve after curve after curve, drug after drug after drug, cell line after cell line after cell line, but they do dose response viability curves in combination for a year, and they get enough data for their entire PhD. Versus me, I had a transgenic mouse model of leukemia, and it took a year and a half to get the first phenotype, another year and a half to breed the second transgene in, and another 2 years to figure out that the second transgene didn't cause a phenotype, right? Which one of us is more productive? And so the problem with a universal measure of productivity in STEM is that STEM is universal, but STEM is actually not universally constructed. So what matters is very context dependent in terms of what a grad student is doing, in terms of what a postdoc is doing, in terms of what a scientist is doing as a faculty member, right? So productivity is a bit of a loaded term, right? So we talk about papers, we talk about theses, we talk about conference presentations, we talk about oral versus poster, right? Some of those things are crapshoots, right? We could talk about what could we talk about? We could talk about how many students you mentored as a graduate student or as a postdoc. You could talk about courses that you taught. You could talk about papers that you read, right? All of those things are potentially aspects of productivity. And so it's really, really difficult to identify this one thing and say, that's productivity, right? But I think it's actually worth it to recognize, and this is how inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility plays a role. I think it's worth it to recognize that everyone's lived circumstances are going to be distinct enough that whatever definition of productivity that we use, we have to appreciate that different people are going to come to it differently, right? So what happens, for example, if you are moving through your PhD, but all of a sudden a close relative passes away, And bereavement leave in Canada is 3 days. What's bereavement leave in the United States?
Ooh, that's a great question. I gave a PhD student a week, but I think that was my discretion. That wasn't something I had to do.
Right. And so let's assume bereavement leave in the United States is 0 days. Right? You get time off.
I think if you work for a company, it's probably a couple of days.
Right.
It's not going to be long.
But bereavement leave and the construction around bereavement leave is built around the construction around a Judeo-Christian funeral service.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Hindu funeral rites last for 2 weeks.
Yeah. Okay, I just looked it up. It's
Funeral.
3 to 5 days for immediate family members. So it has to be a spouse, a child, or a parent. If it's outside of that, you don't receive bereavement leave.
But what happens if it's your best friend?
Doesn't
What
count.
happens if it's a grandparent? What happens if it's a close cousin or an aunt? What happens if it's your four-legged companion who's been with you for the last 15 years?
That is very true. It does say that some companies may offer a little time for either an extended family member or a friend, but that's a may.
Right. But, and the point that I'm actually trying to make here is that whatever bereavement leave you get doesn't take into account the mental health consequences of this person who's close to you passing away.
Mhm.
And so, say the first 2 years of your PhD, everything is moving really well. And you're like, I'm absolutely going to be done when my residency requirement is over. And then this close person passes away, and then all of a sudden, things don't go so well.
Yeah, I looked it up because obviously California, where I live, tends to have better rules about this. So it says California does not mandate that bereavement leave be paid, but employers are required to provide up to 5 days of unpaid leave. However, you can use other available paid time off, such as vacation or sick time, to be paid during your bereavement leave if you choose to do so.
But then you don't get those 5 days. And if you're sick later on,
Correct.
right? So it's a choice between being paid for the time away or gambling that you need time away later. Right? That's, you know, you may have heard the expression Hobson's choice.
I don't know. I don't think I'm familiar.
He's a British farmer from the 1700s. He used to say to folks who would come by his farm in the countryside, you can have absolutely any horse you want, as long as it's the horse next to the door.
Okay.
Those aren't choices.
No. I'm going to put the most rubbish horse possible next to the door, and that's the one you're taking.
But that's exactly what he did, apparently. Right? That's the point of the story. You can have anything you want, but it's the thing closest to the door. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a choice that's actually not a choice. But the point that I'm driving at, though, is that you've got this scenario where life intervenes, right? And all of a sudden things change for you, and so how does that actually impact productivity?
Mm-hmm.
Right? What is productivity and how we think about it? And so the way that I actually think about the application of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility principles to productivity is whatever that definition is in the space that I'm in. I think it's worth it to recognize that life happens. I think it's worth it to recognize that people aren't always the same from start to finish, that things can change, lived experience can change, circumstances can change. And how we measure ourselves needs to reflect those changes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think unless we can do that, then we're holding ourselves to a standard that doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense, right? So then how do we actually think about productivity through the lens of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility? Well, I think we need to recognize that that in the knowledge economy, productivity is more about the acquisition and sharing of knowledge than it is the sort of the specific kind of widget making analogies that might come from the manufacturing realm, right? And in the knowledge economy, if we're interested in the acquisition and sharing of knowledge, then we have to think about what are the timescales around acquisition and sharing of knowledge. And do pieces of knowledge count, or does only the whole story count, right? Does it matter that it took me 14 months from start to finish, from the time that we started to work with the mouse colony until the time we actually had the phenotype to generate the phenotype of my transgenic mouse model? Or does it matter that the paper came out a year and a half after that? Right? But the paper coming out a year and a half after that was less within my control, right? The actual gathering of the knowledge, that was slightly more within my control, right? I mean, mice will do whatever they want when they're breeding, right? Can't really force them. But what are we talking about in the context of productivity, and how much of it is in the control of the person that we're trying to measure said productivity of, right?
And you need to remember that it's field specific, right? Because as a biochemist and molecular biologist, I can churn out experiments far faster than anyone working with mice.
Yes, that is absolutely correct, right? Or as an organic chemist, you can churn out experiments faster than a molecular biologist can, right? As a physicist, actually as an astrophysicist, then you're kind of stuck doing what the universe is going to do.
Yeah, but right? Also that is, oh yes, we can talk about one of my favorite things. Have you heard of Jan Henrik Schön? I think I'm saying that name right.
No.
So he is a person who did something with semiconductors, and he was publishing in really highly prestigious journals very quickly, like every couple of weeks, every third week or something. Insane. It was absolute insanity how quickly this person was publishing. And that should have been the hint that something was wrong, because nobody publishes that quickly, right?
No, but here's the other thing though. In some spaces, like in computer science and in physics and in astronomy, you can publish the preprint, right? But in molecular biology, biochemistry, publishing the preprint is much less likely. So
this was before preprints.
Okay.
And I found the book because this is one of the things that I talk about in my ethics class. So this chap, and the book is amazing. So Plastic Fantastic, How the Biggest Fraud in Physics Shook the Scientific World. And it's written by Eugenie Samuel Reich. It's a fantastic read, but basically because he worked theoretically in two different locations, he was saying he was doing one thing at one location and then doing something at a different location. So neither of the people in either location could confirm or deny what he was up to. And if memory serves, the reason he became unstuck was because a couple of scientists actually this is showing how old this is. They took the graphs that he did and they put them on overhead transparencies, and then they overlaid them and realized it was the same graph repeated multiple times. He just changed the axes and said it was a different experiment. And so I want to say eventually he had his PhD stripped from him. And I don't know what he does now, but it probably isn't anything scientific. But realistically, everyone was like, this guy's going to win the Nobel Prize in physics because he's just like the bee's knees. But realistically, he was publishing so quickly because he was literally making up data.
Well, and so there was a similar story in the head and neck cancer research space where this group in Scandinavia was just churning out data from clinical samples collected from theoretically patients with head and neck cancer, turned out that every single one of those patients had the same birthday.
What are the chances of that?
Right. And so I think you have to wonder also, the culture that sort of fosters that sense of, well, I have to do this, right? So why does somebody make stuff up? Why does somebody fake their pace of data generation and data collection, right? And if what matters is how many papers we publish per year, right?
Mhm.
And then you have this selection pressure that says if you publish more, you're more successful, right? If your productivity is measured in how many grants you're holding, right? Then the more that you're holding or the more that you're on, the more you spread yourself thinly, then the better off you are, right? And so the challenge ends up being that the selection pressure that we have for how we do science and how we define productivity, number one, that selection pressure doesn't favor um, folks in equity owed groups or folks who are from marginalized or underrepresented groups. But also number two, the selection pressure actually doesn't say anything about quality. It only says about quantity of something, right? Here's an interesting sort of example. We care a lot about how many Nature papers or Cell or Science papers comes out, like a postdoc is attached to during their time as a postdoc. That helps us understand, theoretically, it helps us understand their productivity or future productivity as a working scientist. I had this really interesting, somewhat surreal experience with a faculty interview at one point where the director of the Cancer Research Institute I'd applied to said, look, you clearly are quite capable of running a lab, and you're quite capable of mentoring students, and you're quite capable of generating high quality science and publishing high quality science, and everybody on the selection committee knows that you can do that. But you don't have 2 Nature papers to your name. And it turned out that the candidate that half the selection committee wanted, who was the local boy who'd gone off to St. Jude's to do a postdoc, he came back with 2 Nature papers, but no demonstration that he could run a lab, right? And so I mean, you think about the productivity of a postdoc. The output is the number of papers that they publish, and theoretically the quality is judged by where they publish them, right? But that skill set isn't the skill set that you need to run a lab to train students to generate those papers.
Correct. And I think the assumption is that if you have published well, that you either have the skill set or you have the abilities to gain the skill set in order to run a lab and train people successfully. But that is not always the case.
But that's actually that's assuming facts, not in evidence.
Mhm.
There's absolutely no evidence that that's the case.
Correct.
Right?
I can think about a number of PIs who maybe shouldn't be running their own labs.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so when this sort of gets at the conversation around merit, which we may not have time for in this particular video, but if we measure the wrong thing, right, then at the end of the day, we're not really understanding what a person's contributing, right? The other thing I actually wanted to say about this is we care specifically about papers, right? So if the measure of productivity is how much do you publish, then conference presentations, right? Knowledge mobilization to the non-technical public, right? Articles in non-technical journals, those things don't count, right? But you could be a dynamite science communicator, right? And you could be somebody who feels a calling to explain your science and the science in your field to the world. And so you invest the time in the blogging, and you invest the time in the videos, and you invest the time in the, I'm going to write an article for wherever, right? And so that's your passion. That's part of your contribution to the field, but it's not counted. Right?
Correct. And I do know at least one person who presented the same poster repeatedly, but changed the title subtly. So it looked like they were presenting different things. And they were like, wow, look at how many times they've presented. But I knew it was the exact same poster, just printed off with a different title. And that's just naughty.
Well, they had to have generated different abstracts as well, right? Because you have to be able to validate when you submit those things at conferences that you've not presented it at another conference or presented it in any other scientific setting.
Ooh, interesting. I don't know, but we're talking 15 plus years ago.
Yep.
This sort of, okay, maybe.
Yep. So productivity, it depends on what you're defining as productivity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the notion of productivity equals only, for example, the scientific publication, right? So that's an interesting sort of reflection. And I think it's a narrow reflection, right? The one time my postdoc supervisor and I had a little bit of an argument was actually after he and I worked together when I was preparing what became Creating a Culture of Accessibility in the Sciences, which is the book I wrote about this space. He said to me, Mahadeo, you need to write a series of science articles. No one's going to read the book, right? And actually what he meant was no scientist is going to read the book, right? And it's interesting because on the one hand, I felt that he was right, and I also felt that he was wrong. He was right in that if I had published a series of science articles or a series of Nature Communications or a series of something within an academic journal, then my stamp on this space within the academic community would have been assured, right? And because I didn't do that, nobody within the academic community actually thinks I've done anything in the space because they don't know who I am. But then everybody else has read the book. Right? So, I mean, it sort of depends on who is your target audience.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I think that's a really good illustration. Another good illustration that I can think of, I used to work in a space where I was cheek by jowl with rehab practitioners, right? And these folks were never found at a scientific conference and could barely be found at a practitioner conference, and could never be bothered to because they didn't have the time to write up their stuff, right? Every academic that I ever met who was interested in understanding questions to do with rehabilitation and vision loss rehabilitation or vocational rehabilitation of persons with vision loss, unless they had direct connections to the practitioners, which were few and far between, they kept asking questions the practitioners had already answered. Right? Because the thing is, the practitioners never wrote anything for the academic journals, but the academicians never read anything else. Right? And so we can talk about what productivity is, and at the end of the day, the answer is it's going to be different for everybody. But the real barrier ends up being, and this is going to come across even more cynical than what I might have said before, science in many ways is very self-referential. And we exist within this closed circle of being able to envision the world through the scientific lens, and nobody else can do what we do. Therefore, we only care about our own closed circle, right? Except that people outside that closed circle fund the closed circle. People outside the closed circle vote the people into office who decide what to do with that closed circle, right? And so that closed circle doesn't actually exist in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so when we think about productivity, we really have to think about productivity in such a way so that we are recognizing the sweep of possible engagement, right? And from my perspective, productivity equals the acquisition and sharing of knowledge, right? But there's a million different things in that, and it matters what aspect of science we're doing, and it matters how life intersects with all of that. Very long-winded answer to your question.
Very, very interesting and insightful. Well, with that, we're going to end. I'm going to ask Mahadeo a few more questions, which we don't have time for right now. So watch this space. Thank you for joining us today. Please like and subscribe to both my channel and Mahadeo's Idea STEM. And I will see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.